So let me introduce to you who we have up here with me this morning. This is Shawn Sullivan. He's president of Mission 823. He's a member of our church family working in Ukraine. At one point was a missionary in Ukraine. You'll hear more about his story. Next to him is Oleg Shelashkiy, president of Ukraine Without Orphans. At the end is Nikolai Kuleba, the Ombudsman for the Rights of Children for the Office of the President in Ukraine. If you would, just welcome them, let them know you're glad they're here this morning. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here with us today. Oleg and Nikolai were in the country and made a special effort in their itinerary to be here with us today and again this evening you'll hear about, so I appreciate that very much. First, Shawn, let me just start here with you. You know, we watched that video and it's a moving story, but the crisis in Ukraine is much larger than just one story. Tell us a little bit about what's going on.
Well, when you say the word crisis, that is indeed the fact. I was with a gentleman, pastor from Winter Garden, who described it as the world orphan crisis, and that's absolutely the fact. And so the way that we stay sane, the way that we stay motivated is by focusing on the faces and the names of those children that we know personally. But the fact of the matter is that the orphan situation in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe is really, really desperate. When we came to Ukraine, God interrupted our plans. They were plans that He had given us, but He had other ideas for us to serve through the church greater to meet the needs of children. And so a lady called me one morning and asked me to drive her to the graduation ceremony for an orphanage in northern Ukraine. And that stopped me in my tracks. I'd never really thought about the fact that children who live in orphanages or without parents would never experience family that's healthy and stable. They would never know what a true mom and dad was that loves them. And so that intrigued me. We went to this little orphanage and met about 150 kids and very quickly realized that this is not an isolated situation, that this is not just the only orphanage in Ukraine, that there are more than 750 of these types of facilities around the country, including at that time a little more than 120 to 130,000 children. And then magnify that by the fact that children who can't abide with their home situation or with the situation, the conditions at the orphanage, about another 120,000 or so children at that time lived on the street with no shelter whatsoever. So our first reaction was a humanitarian one, and it was right. And we began to relieve the needs of these kids and their humanitarian situation, clothes and shoes and heat and water, those sorts of things. But we realized very quickly that the age-out difficulty for these children when they graduate from the orphanage, this graduation for us is first day of the rest of our lives. For them, it's really the end of opportunity, the end of shelter, the end of security. And so we began to work with these types of children and then later received a license to allow us to take children of all ages. And so that's where Mission 823 came from. Mission 823 comes from Psalms chapter 82, verse 3, where the Bible says, defend the poor and the fatherless, do justice, make things right to the afflicted and needy. And so we began a quest to match and partner these children, these suffering children, with Christian families, and then meet the needs of all other types of crisis children as well, kids at risk. Especially magnified in that situation is the problem with the conflict in eastern Ukraine and the occupation of Crimea. There's been a war in Ukraine for over 5 years now, almost 5 years now to February, and millions of people, 1.6 million people have been displaced from their homes, and that puts about another 800,000 children, in addition to the 250,000 that we were dealing with before, at risk for exploitation, vulnerability, suffering, abandonment. And so we needed a global vision to be able to move this thing forward because we couldn't do it by ourselves.
So, Oleg, this crisis is huge. It's very, so tell us a little about what Ukraine Without Orphans is about and how what it sees as the solution.
Yes, of course. Thank you for this opportunity to share today. And Ukraine Without Orphans is not an organization, it's a movement of individuals, churches, and organizations that work together for the common goal of reaching every child, every orphan with genuine Christian care. And our goal is to see all children in Ukraine living in families, not in orphanages, in conditions of safety and well-being, as a result of joint efforts of the church, government, and civil society. And we understand that nobody can do it alone, and there should be a partnership of all these players. But we believe and we know that the church can and should play a leading role in this process. And we believe that it's possible that the church can be the key player in making this happen. And so our vision is Ukraine without orphans, that all children will have a people who love them. And Ukraine without orphans started 10 years ago with leaders of the ministries that have been working with orphans and street kids for over 10 years by that time. And we've seen God work and do this already through the church, when we had thousands of children living on the street and nobody did anything for them. Government had no solutions for them. The church, people were the first ones to reach out for them, begin to build programs to help them, to feed them clothes, and then take them out from the street. And a few years later, government began to pay attention to this and build infrastructure for that. Civil society joined. So probably 12, 13 years later, we had no kids living on the street. So in 2007, I would say, even now, you wouldn't see street kids in Ukraine, but in the end of 90s, it seemed impossible to see this time. I couldn't believe that there'll be time when we have no street kids. And it all started with church efforts. So when we started Ukraine without orphans, we believed that God can move and bring significant change through the church. And we had about 40,000 orphans in the orphanages who needed families. And we had about 36,000 local churches in Ukraine at that time. So we figured out all it takes is one family from each church to adopt one child, and we can have Ukraine without orphans. So this is how we started. We worked for 10 years, and a lot of churches responded, a lot of Christians responded, and the government did a lot of things, civil society did a lot of things. So over the last 10, 15 years, over 30,000 children were adopted in Ukrainian families. Number of children in foster care versus orphanages grew from 1,000 in 2005 to almost 15,000 children now. So we see a bigger problem now, more complex. We see there should be more holistic solutions so that we don't even have kids coming to the orphanages. So we're working on the bigger strategy how the church can be involved on all the levels of community to work with that. And that's, Nikolai will share more about that probably.
Yeah, it's very interesting to have Nikolai with us today, who is working for the office of the president in Ukraine and responsible for the rights of children, and you're kind of that advocate. Tell us a little about that strategy of what you're trying to do, and unique to have, as I said earlier today, it's unique in this country to have government willing to work with churches. It doesn't happen in a lot of circles very well, and for it to happen there at the level it is right now, tell us a little about that.
Good morning, church. It's normal when government collaborate with churches because every child needs Jesus, I think. Yeah, and in God's kingdom, no one orphan. Yeah, because we are His children, and for us, it's very important in this time when we have this conflict and these issues. Very important, church will be active and do this work with children. And we believe that it's possible to have country without orphans, region without orphans, community without orphans. It depends on how we are effective. That's why we try and unite these Christian resources. We try through the church activities reach each child, not only orphans, not only abandoned children, but all children needs love. And sometimes they don't have love in their families. It's very important to give them through ministries to give them opportunity to know about God's love, through the services, to give them food, clothes. A lot of children need this through the different activities. That's why government invite churches, and now we have process of creating communities, because all power was from the former Soviet country, was on the central level. Now it goes to the community level. And a lot of churches, local churches, need this experience, how be effective, how effectively reach kids, save their lives. That's why I want to thank you, that you support, because a lot of American churches, citizens, helps Ukraine now. And mission is very active in Ukraine, and through them, a lot of children have this opportunity to be God's children. And thank you so much. Thank you for your activities. thank you, Pastor, for your church. And for me, it was revelation, your sermon. It's great. Thank you.
Well, absolutely. We're honored. Let them know you're glad you're here. And here's what I want to say, too. Interesting what you said. You know, in the past, during the Soviet Union, services came through the government, and now the churches are having to almost relearn how to be the church and how to serve in that way. And one of the things I said a couple weeks ago at our 20th anniversary is that God has blessed and given us so much. Our particular church, I don't think he's given us that to hold on to and to just be grateful, but he's given us any and everything he's given us to open our hands and to share. And that includes our experience and the wisdom and the things that we've learned to be able to share. And I've had the chance to go with Shawn and be there and seen some of the kids in that video and and learn more firsthand, and to know that we are as a church partnering with an organization that is partnering with other people in Ukraine at a very high reputable level, and we can able together to do much more than any one of us can alone. So tonight, I don't do this a lot, but I'm going to ask tonight, 6 o'clock tonight, they're going to be back here this evening, and they're going to share in detail what's going on and their plans to make a difference there, and how we can be a part of serving alongside that. I hope you'll join us back at 6 o'clock this evening.
Come in June.
In June, they're going to hear more about it later. We're planning a trip. We will be having a trip in June this year from our church headed there, partnering with Shawn and Mission 823. So we're going to tell you all about that as well. But guys, hope you come back tonight. Gentlemen, thank you again for being here this morning. Appreciate it very much.
Yeah, and I read in advertisement that you inviting for real snow. In Ukraine, real snow now. Welcome.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, man. God bless you, man.